Fermez les yeux.
Close your eyes.
Est-ce que vous avez fermé les yeux?
Have you closed your eyes?
Vous voyez
You'll see
des points de lumière.
points of light.
Serrez fort.
Shut your eyes tightly.
Les lumières se précisent.
The points of light become clearer.
Il y a des personnages. Il y a
People come into focus.
la vie se crée.
Life is created.
Il y a toute une histoire qui se crée selon
A whole story unfolds
la direction du vent que vous voulez.
according to the direction of the wind that you choose.
L'histoire se crée.
The story is here.
Et puis,
And then
on ouvre les yeux,
you open your eyes
on a une histoire.
and you have a story.
These are the words of Djibril Diop Mambéty, a film director from Senegal.
Growing up in Dakar, Mambéty would often sneak out to go to the cinema, but without enough money to purchase a ticket, he would simply have to listen to the movies from outside the theater.
This experience had profound effects on Mambéty, whose approach to filmmaking has become notable for its unique usage of sound.
This podcast is titled Narrative Soundscapes in African Storytelling. I'm Emma.
And I'm Vaughn, and today we're discussing the 1973 film Touki Bouki.
The narrative storytelling of African films is not singular. They follow multiple paths, tell multiple stories. As Vlad Dima writes, African stories tend to bend back upon themselves, to circle as they circulate, so that their fabric contains many interlocking stories and permutations of stories. Through the medium of film, visual and oral components have the capacity to be complementary or contrasting, which allows this multiplicity of meaning to unfold in parallel realms.
In Touki Bouki, sound functions not merely as an extension of the visual, but to create its own distinct narrative, mirroring the oral traditions of African storytelling.
Let's explore how this narrative level is achieved. Mambéty uses synchronous, asynchronous, extra-diegetic, and contrapuntal sound to challenge the primacy of visual storytelling. Mambéty has said,
I do not choose the music, I choose the sound. All movement is accompanied by a sense. It has to do with stimulation. From the images I do the music, from the music I do the sound. But sound is not something foreign to adorn the film. It's intrinsic to the film. It magnifies the action.
The nuances of Mambéty's use of contrapuntal sound can be explored through a close examination of one of the most striking scenes in Touki Bouki. The scene does not make consistent use of contrapuntal sound. However, there's a clear shift from sound to image, as a sex scene takes place predominantly on an oral rather than visual plane. The visuals of the scene are fractured and nonlinear. Sonically, it begins with a cacophony, the crash of waves, the cries of vultures, the thudding of Anta's feet careening down the side of the cliff. The soundscape is further complicated by the distortion of the shrieking birds, their cries now sounding electronic and synthetic. Then the echoing laughter of the sorceress is superimposed over the birds, emerging at the front of the oral plane in a rack focus effect. The opening of this scene has the effect of déjà vu. Visually, we've already seen nearly identical shots in the cross-cut editing. Orally, many of the sounds we hear are recognizable, notably the laughter. This speaks to the circular nature of African storytelling and the resistance to linearity and chronology. Stories are allowed to unfold non-chronologically, taking diversions and existing on multiple planes. This is a signature of Mambéty's work. As Vlad Dima writes,
I find the disconnect between sound and image to be Mambéty's creative niche, the mark of a personal style that establishes his body of work as a bridging point between third cinema and auteur cinema.
the sexual component of this scene is figured almost entirely on the oral plane. We hear two separate components, the crashing of waves against the jagged shoreline, and the moans of Anta that emerge in a sonic rack-focused movement. The visual plane is predominantly occupied by the waves, but the sonic rack focus is mirrored by a visual rack focus shot of Anta's hand on the Dogon cross. The camera shifts in and out of focus, and the audio does the same, connecting the visual and oral planes through formal devices rather than overt synthesis. In fact, the only visual depiction of the bodies presumably having sex is the shot of Anta's hand. The climax of the scene, the orgasm, constitutes a metaphorical recombination of the oral and visual planes. A shot of a large wave crashing against a rock occurs alongside an intensification of moaning before the soundscape calms to the sound of waves against the shore. Another interesting separation between planes occurs as we realize we have heard Anta's moans, but not Mori's. The scene is aligned with Anta's sexual pleasure, constituting a fracture of perspective. The use of sound in Touki Bouki is inseparably linked to the griot. In West Africa, the griots function as the narrators of oral traditions. They're simultaneously storytellers, poets, historians, genealogists, and musicians, passing down the epics of their communities through songs and stories. Touki Bouki translates to the journey of the hyena, invoking the work Contes d'Amadou Koumba, a collection of short stories transcribed by Senegalese poet and storyteller Birago Diop from his family's griot, Amadou Koumba.
Let's explore that title, Journey of the Hyena. This symbolic emphasis of the hyena, a creature associated with greed, lies, shamelessness, is just one example of the significance of animals in Mambéty's storytelling. And notably, the sounds of animals are utilized to great effect in Touki Bouki. One of the most prominent animals that we hear in the film is the vulture, described as first cousin to the hyena, insinuating its symbolic similarities. The cry of the vulture can be heard 3 times throughout the film, each instance during a time of anxiety and peril. What's even more interesting is the way the sound is manipulated. Human voices are added to mimic the sound of the birds. The first time the vultures appear, we can hear Aunt Umi's maniacal laughs transposed upon the bird calls. This strange effect not only creates a disturbing sonic landscape for Anta's emotions, but also calls into question Aunt Umi's symbolic similarities to the vulture. She curses Mori to the depths of hell for his debts to her, pointing to her greed and materialism. In the next instance of the vultures, Mori and Anta's taxi driver decides to take a peek inside the case they had just stolen. With the startling sound of an explosion, we see a human skull staring back at us. And just as the taxi driver begins to scream in punctuated screeches, the cries of the vultures emerge simultaneously. This mirrors the symbolic function of the last example. The taxi driver, in a moment of unbridled greed, decides to explore the presumed treasures of the mysterious suitcase, but he is confronted by a dark reality. In the final exemplary scene, Mori and Anta speed away from the rich man's estate with suitcases filled with clothes, when the squawks of the vultures start up again. At the same time, the anomalous Tarzan character abruptly interrupts the narrative space. The man's wild shrieks mirror the vulture's calls, which are played in tandem. It's fitting, then, that this occurs at a time of absolute greed, with Mori driving stolen goods in a stolen car. This, in addition to the other instances, is evidence of narrative complexity on an oral level. In addition to the vultures, Touki Bouki is characterized by the sounds of cattle as well. At the beginning of the film, the groans of livestock and the whistle of an African aerophone ground us in traditional subsistence lifestyle, while immediately after, the cries of cows in the slaughterhouse hints at a symbolic destruction of this way of life. And as the flute plays, we hear the growl of a motorcycle. And suddenly it's Mori, riding through the village with a longhorn skull attached to his bike. And thus the conflicts of modernity are captured in sonic form. Later, the sounds of cattle can be heard over Josephine Baker's song Paris, which repeats as a cyclical, sardonic motif throughout the whole movie. The song acts as a vehicle for Mori and Anta's fantastical dreams of escape, and is especially ironic considering the persona and background of its singer, a black woman who is fetishized for her exotic appeal. Even when cattle are not visually present, their symbolic significance is still expressed through sound. At the end of the film, Mori is about to board the ship to Europe when he is suddenly paralyzed by an anxious reluctance that causes him to sprint back home. The ship's horn blows, and it's eerily similar to the groan of livestock. The implication is that Mori, unlike his counterpart, cannot leave Senegal. Concepts of imaginary home and symbolic return, Both staples of post-colonial narratives are embodied to full effect here. And as Maury is drawn back home, the cries of the slaughterhouse, coupled with total cacophony, create a bewildering sonic atmosphere, wherein this profound sense of displacement can proliferate.
In one of the final scenes, the French intellectuals on the ship criticize Senegal as physically and intellectually barren, describing African art as a joke made up by journalists. But the characters are not conversing or responding to one another. Their declarations simply float through the oral plane in a contrapuntal collage. Their comments are used in an ironic fashion, as the film itself contradicts the claim that African art is somehow false.
In his critique of national identity, author Frantz Fanon writes that
the colonized intellectual, at the very moment when he undertakes a work of art, fails to realize that he is using techniques borrowed from the occupier. He is content to cloak these instruments in a style that is meant to be national, but which is strangely reminiscent of exoticism.
Touki Bouki is just the opposite. While at times drawing from elements of the French New Wave, the film is authentic in its mode of storytelling, emulating the oral tradition in cinematic form. As such, it is one of the most honest portrayals of African identity ever put to film.